Welcome back to the Querying and Selecting Spatial Data module. In this portion, we're going to talk about attribute queries in ArcPy. The ArcPy tool that executes attribute queries is called Select Layer by Attribute. This particular tool is located in the Data Management toolbox that has that shortened name of Management. Here you can see the two defined syntaxes that work for Select Layer by Attribute. And the reminder here that the in layer for this tool is the out layer from your Make Feature Management tool that we discussed earlier. A special note here is for you to notice also that there is no out layer or out feature class parameter for this tool. So you're not creating new GIS data with the selection tools. You're simply selecting existing records from an existing layer file, that in-memory copy. So there's no out data set, there is just an in-feature layer for this tool. Here's another look at the syntax for the tool. So you can see the syntax here on the top right, and the breakdown of the tool parameters in the explanation. So notice that it clearly tells you that the in-layer data type is a table view or a layer, and also note the available selection types. So you know you're not going to be putting in a GIS data set, you have to put in a layer. And the selection types here, it says that are optional, but these are all the options that you have. Notice that if you don't put in a selection type into the Select Layer by Attribute tool, it will by default do new selection. And how do you know that? You know that because it says this is the default right here. So for many optional parameters, there's going to be a default option that gets run if you don't make any selection. So typically you want to do a new selection when you're selecting by attributes, but you also have the additional options of adding to the existing selected set, removing from an existing selected set, subsetting from that. So you're going to select a subset from an existing set. You can switch selection or you can clear selection. And these are all things that are typically available as buttons in ArcPro in the interactive world, but these are things that you need to just be aware of what you want to do with your data as you're scripting out the tool. Finally, you'll need to notice as well that the tool, like I mentioned before, does not have any output to place in its syntax for an out feature class or an out layer because it doesn't create anything new. What it does is it operates off of the in layer, but it has a derived output. The derived output is a selected set on this in layer. So you can see here it's the updated inputs with the selections applied, and it's going to be either a table view, raster layer, or feature layer. All right, so here is a code snippet for an example for Select Layer by Attribute. In this example, we have a layer called Chihuahua Cities. Then it's been created by an earlier run of Make Feature Layers, because by now, remember, we know that this tool can only accept feature layers. So we know that Chihuahua Cities is going to be a variable that's holding a layer file that is in quotation marks. We know that the selection type being done is a subset selection, and we know that because it puts that string in there. And how did they know to write it as subset selection? Well, the person who did this snippet of code would have been looking at the help documentation to know that this particular parameter of selection type has to be a string in the tool, and these are the options. These uppercase options words are the options to put into the tool. So they've put in subset selection, and then the last thing here is your selection query, your where clause. And for this where clause, they've chosen to do that a population field where the number is greater than 10,000. So I want you to take note of this SQL query structure because we've talked a lot about our SQL query structures up until now. Notice that you don't have any real stacked quotation marks for this one, and there are no escaped out pairs of quotation marks. That is because the item inside of population is a number and not a string. So the field contents, that 10,000, doesn't need quotation marks around it. That's why you can just have a set of quotation marks surrounding the query string and then a separate set of quotation marks around the field name. Okay, so let's walk through a more comprehensive example. Let's look at what the ArcPy code would be for selecting all records from this particular facility's GIS dataset, where the facility field here contains the words health center. So what I've done is given you for context what this would look like in ArcPro. This would be a copy of the table we would be looking at. You would probably click on this Select by Attributes button here in the table, and then this is what the result would be. If we're looking at our facilities data and we selected out just those where the facilities was equal to Health Center, these ones in blue would be the facilities that were selected. Now let's look at the ArcPy script that accomplishes this same thing. So let's walk through it line by line. Up top, you're going to notice that we've imported the ArcPy module. We've set the overwrite output to be true. That way we could run this script multiple times and overwrite our data sets for us. That's always just a good best practices for being able to run a script multiple times. We've set our workspace to be where our data is sitting. And we have the syntax of all of the codes, all of the tools that we're going to be using. We know if we're going to be doing a selection, we have to first use the Make Feature Layer tool. So I've gone out to the help documentation and I've copied and pasted in the syntax for that tool. I also know if I'm going to select by attributes, I need the Select Layer by Attribute tool, and I've gone and looked for that online and copied and pasted the syntax for that tool in here as well. We also know that we're going to need to have an SQL query. We're going to have to figure out what is the query for selecting health centers out of facilities. So here I've told myself that it's the facility field and that inside of it is health center, and it's all uppercase. Next, we're going to fill out our Make Feature Layer tool. Now, a common best practice is to put the actual layer that you're creating, which is a string, into a variable. So this variable called facilities layer is going to hold the string of facilities layer, which is our layer file. Okay, we've created this so that it can be the input into our Select Layer by Attribute Management tool. Next, we're going to define what our SQL query, our where clause, is going to be. What are we going to select for on our facilities data set? So we're going to put that inside of a variable. Why? Well, we're just going to put it inside of the variable because when we go to fill out our tool parameters, it makes for a much cleaner tool parameter. It's not required, but when this string gets in here, it gets hard to decipher what's going on. So a common practice is to put your SQL query inside of a variable. Here, notice that our query string does have the escaped characters because our entire SQL query must be within a set of quotation marks. We know that our field names must be in quotation marks. And if your field type is a string or a text type, whatever is sitting in there must also be within quotation marks. So we have escaped out the single quotation marks to be the pair that goes around our field contents. Then we're going to populate our Select Layer by Attribute tool. Notice I've done the underscore management methodology, but you could also do the arcpy.management.toolname methodology. The first thing it needs is an in layer or view. Well, that's what I've created here with my Make Feature Layer. So I'm going to put in facilities underscore LYR. The next thing it wants, which is actually an optional parameter type, but I want to be specific and tell it to do a new selection. And I know that the options that are available have to be strings because I've looked at the help documentation. So here I'm going to put in new selection, all in caps. And then the next thing I want to add in is my where clause. Even though it's an optional parameter, I want it included. And I've built that up here. My SQL query has already been built and stored in a variable called my selection. After I do that, it is selected. This facilities layer will have a new selection, a subsetted selection set. Now, to gain access to it, to know what's going on in there and see how many records you have selected, you're going to take advantage of a tool called Get Count Management. Get Count Management just has one required input, which is whatever data set or layer you want to see how many things are either inside of it or selected inside of it. One good way to use this tool is to put what it returns into a variable because it's going to return a number. And you're going to put that into a variable. So I just named it CNT, which is short for count. Count is equal to arcpy.getCount, which lives in the management toolbox, facilities layer. I also could have just put in the variable of facilities layer. Both of those would be valid inputs into this tool. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the count, I'm going to print the number, and then I'm going to give myself also a nice print statement that tells me that the number of facilities that are healthcare centers in this data set is, and it's going to report out to me Notice I have to put string here because this is a string and this is a number. So in order to include them in a single print statement, I have to convert this number to a string. And then at the end here, I'm just going to delete the facilities layer, which is a best practice. So this script right here gives me this output. The number of facilities that are health care centers in the data set is 36. And notice it's printed out just the number here and then that nice print statement for me as well. Okay, so you may also be thinking, well, oftentimes when I'm doing this type of work as a GIS process in my workflow, I often want to save out what I've selected to a new data set. Well, you can easily do this by taking advantage of the ArcPy geoprocessing tool called Copy Features. And Copy Features lives in the management toolbox as well. The syntax for this tool is that it has two required parameters, an in features and an out feature class. Notice that the output from this tool is an on-disk saved GIS dataset. It is not a layer, it is an actual GIS dataset. And how do you know that? You go to the help documentation. So here is a copy of the help documentation that shows you the syntax again, shows you the breakdown and the explanation of each of the parameters, and we can see clearly here that the in features required parameter is a feature layer, and the out feature class is a feature class that will be created into which the features will be copied is an actual feature class. So that's what's telling us that we're going to store a data set on disk. So we're going to come back. Here is our original script. Now I have also updated it with some lines of code to copy that to a new data set. So let's blow that up a little bit. So here are the lines of code that you would add immediately after your selection to copy what's selected in your layer into a new data set. So I'm just copying what has been selected on my facilities layer into a new data set called facilities_health-centers.shape. Now I have a workspace defined already in my script. What this means is that this shape file will be stored in this particular workspace. So a nice way to tell the user that not only has a new data set been created, but where it's located is to add a print statement that tells them the name of the data set and then also tells them that the new data set can be found in that particular workspace. And you can just use the arcpy.env workspace that you've set up and you can put that into your print statement. Okay, so while the scripting and coding of all of this may be new to you, what I want you to think about is that the workflow of doing this is not different. This is the same workflow that your geoprocessing tasks take all the time. So let's walk through this because every GIS project is going to have a workflow. And for a basic attribute selection in ArcPro, you would do the following. You would first open the Select by Attributes tool. You would then create a query in the tool on a defined data set. You would view the selected set, and then you would perhaps save the selected set to its own data set by using the Export Data geoprocessing tool that can also be found on the right-click menu if you right-click the actual data set in your table of contents. So in ArcPy, you have a very similar workflow, and I'm going to be encouraging you to write out these steps in this workflow within your scripts at the top so that you can see how you are going to build the structure of your scripts as our processes get a little bit more complicated. So in ArcPy, what you would do to accomplish each of these is that you first need to create an in-memory feature layer with the Make Feature Layer tool. You're going to create a query string and store it in a variable for use in the Select by Attributes tool. You're going to execute and run the Select by Attribute tool with all of the required and any of the necessary optional parameters you want to use. And then finally, you would use the Copy Features tool to save those selected records to a new data set. All right, so you're now going to have the opportunity to practice doing your own attribute selections with ArcPy.